More of this crap. So, I think the best way to describe this situation is to simply say it out. Say it. They're being racist. Whoa. Isn't that a bit hasty for me to say? No, no. It's because that's the sticking point for them. Look, if you really want to be frank about it, the people who care that much that it's not a black woman playing Helen of Troy, people who care that much, why do they care? Because they have been told that this is necessary for the salvation of Western civilization. That if you let somebody cast a black woman as Helen of Troy, then all is lost. Yeah, is it even occurred to people to ask why, in God's name, that would be the case? And they'd go, "Oh, look at look at Wakanda. Cast? Why don't we recast T'Challa as a white guy? Hmm. Because then it would be a different story. Different story? Well, it'd be a little bit of a different story if we change the casting of who is Helen of Troy, but it is a lot different of a casting if you cast a white guy as T'Challa. And why is that? Well, because the entire story of Wakanda is a story of an untouched paradise for people of African descent, of Native Africans. It's the whole story is about having something of their own that hasn't been taken from them by force, by colonialism, and all the evils of what it did to Africa. And trust me, they did some substantial evils to Africa. Um, just look up King Leopold and all sort of stuff. You know, what happened in Africa during the you know age of exploration, the 1800s and such, was just genuinely awful. And what's happened over time is also awful. And the notion of having a people who can stand up proudly and say, "We never bent a knee," that is that is a culturally essential part of it. But what does it matter whether Helen of Troy is a white woman or a black woman? It, her role in her role in the Odyssey was never about what this tone of her skin was. In fact, by the standards of many people in the 1800s and before, Helen of Troy wouldn't have even necessarily been considered a white woman. Well, what would she have been considered? A Greek woman. They would have looked at her as a Greek woman. They would have looked at, just like they would have looked at an Italian woman as not being necessarily white. What they considered white was Northern European, was, places, a particular the idea of the Caucasian race. That's a very much of a British, Northern European idea. Race, as we know it today, besides being basically an artifact of a time where what we knew about genetics was basically breeds, like like a Chihuahua versus a an Irish Wolfhound or anything like that. That is the basic notion underlying the idea of a race. Their idea was that black people were one breed, white people, particularly white Northern European people, were one breed, Asians were one breed, and basically mixing between those breeds would create inferior specimens or would pollute the specialness of those specimens. That is the idea of the modern idea of race at its root. The reality is much more local if you really look into it. If you really look into it, it's basically people, I mean, to put it bluntly, people had sex with whoever was nearby. And as they did so, genes spread between the people who were nearby. That's why why genetics tend to follow population, you know, migration and things like that. And why, you know, Egyptians and Italians have more in common genetically than Egyptians and South Africans. Because basically, and it's not even about, oh, but what, how would that work? Wouldn't these people know to keep themselves separate? Well, first of all, for the longest time, it wasn't really even an idea, an issue. Uh, People didn't travel too far, so kind of the jostling wasn't too, didn't go much further than the local area. But what's important here to understand, and what I'm kind of getting distracted from, um, is that only much later did we suddenly say that if you looked at me, if you had this kind of skin, that you were not only a set breed apart, like white lambs or like, you know, golden retrievers or things like that. Not only were you a set apart, that you were genetically distinct, that one white person would be genetically the same as another white person. That is that is sort of the underlying notion. And you'll if you look if we kind of put aside the modern understanding of genetics, which I don't think most racists actually even have a decent understanding of. If you look into that, then you'll kind of realize that a lot of it revolves around sort of the animal husbandry notion of things. That when you really, really strongly identify, you know, yourself as a being according to your race, when you really strongly identify that, and it's not, really tied into, what your local culture and everything, then really, what it amounts to, what whiteness amounts to for a person like me, is a notion that if you look like me, then everybody else who looks like me, including a Russian person who was born of Russian parents, that person and me would have roughly equivalent genetics. And if you got a breed, a barnyard breed of some sort of cow or some sort of sheep or also of some sort of apple tree or some sort of other thing, then this variety, in that case would be strongly bred towards a certain genetic ideal. But the reality, if you look at the genetics, is that it's all a kind of a fuzzy mix, and that local genetics dominate. And so th- I'm starting this out kind of to tell you that at its at the basic level, race is a fiction. Just like the idea of nobility. I'm a special person because I'm born of the nobility. I'm born of the aristocracy. Again, tying back to a notion of barnyard breeding, a notion that if we take all the take all the special people and have them only mate with other special people, then that creates a breed of special people who are better than anybody else to govern us all. That's one of the essential ideas of feudalism. One of the essential ideas of monarchy and aristocracy is that when you get these sorts of people, you know, they are a breed apart, they are a breed above, and we ought to put all of our fates in the hands of those people. This is sort of the fantasy that has some people going, oh, we should just have Trump children running the White House from here to eternity. And if you ever really looked at a dynastic succession, you would know that was pure and utter horse crap. You would know that that was really just another fairy tale, another fiction. And if you look at what people like, what modern a lot of these modern sort of social Darwinists, let me tell you what the law of the jungle amounts to and what alpha stuff amounts to. What they looked at alpha dogs, they looked at alpha um, apes and whatever, and they came to the conclusion that we should all run our society like these pack animals, like these groups of monkeys, and you know that we should all be just fighting for dominance. That is their notion of how things work. They have blatantly misread what the biology of wolves actually are. That you don't have the alpha is essentially a patriarch. Like in a way of speaking, Abraham was the alpha of you know, his clan, of his people. And let's see, Isaac below him would be a beta, and so on through, you know, Jacob and Joseph and so on and so forth. And you would, as time went on, as they would go off and found their own packs, then they would become alpha. What they were looking at was captive wolves, captive wolves who were basically having to sort out between each other, having been tossed in together, in captivity. They're basically doing the rough equivalent of judging family structure, um, of judging family structure by how a prison gang works. That's the description. That's not my original description. That's basically how it's been described to me. Um, and it's this is sort of part of the problem here is that we're assuming that this sort of, you look at the law of the jungle, at social Darwinism, and the assumption here is that somehow if you if you let any kind of weakness, continue to exist in a society, if you don't cull the people who aren't perfectly self-sufficient, aren't perfectly strong and resistant to disease, if you don't cull those people, then everything's going to go to hell. But let me tell you exactly what it means to live by the law of the jungle. It is living like an animal in order to die like an animal. And that's part of what horrifies us about people like the Nazis. They lived like animals and they made themselves and others die like animals. See, that's the thing about it. When you want to kind of assert that there is this sort of, that our civilization is built on the triumph of the strongest, that is fitness, that is survival of the fittest. We are missing something critical here, something essential. And that something essential is, why do human beings have compassion at all? Why? Hmm? I can give you a simple answer. If it wasn't if it wasn't beneficial to the continuation of the species, we wouldn't have it. We have compassion. We have the impulse to care for others, not because we're weak or because we're somehow got some deficiency. We have it because it ensures that more people survive. Because if you look around you, I mean, I was born prematurely. I was born prematurely, and because of that, I could have very easily died. And society wouldn't have gotten 46 years worth of whatever value I've brought to it. 46 years. We have, you know, we get infectious diseases. In the old days, a lot of our children would die of them. There were all kinds of little graves in these old cemeteries. Infectious disease used to be one of the greatest limiters of human population, of the strength and the power of the cities that was out there. And not so long ago, that went away. Did it go away because all of a sudden we bred out the weakness? No, because of this. This is also what spells the difference between most of us being able to survive and most of us not being able to survive. So again, we have a story that, we have a kind of a fairy story that tells us that civilization is dependent upon strong people who do strong things and keep the strength, and that part of this strength is keeping keeping the categories nice and strong, that people have to, that you can't possibly have a black person as Helen of Troy. Because if you did, if you broke down that sort of barrier, who knows what would happen? But we already do know what would happen. There's a very profane, ethnic slur filled um, narrative in True Romance. There's a scene where he basically says that a lot of the look of South European people is influenced by the fact that, well, a lot of dark skinned people came in and bred with the people there. And this, well, I mean, it's not that this is something absolutely new. The Mediterranean region has been seen the mixing of people from different continents for ages. But the long and the short of this story is that it's this mixing, this localized mixing, this geographical mixing that occurs with people. This is what the actual genetics are showing, that what people thought were just solid categories were instead not so compartmentalized, that there was a continuum of genetics, a flow between people of different nearby places, and which makes sense if you think about it. People. I mean, even if it's a question of, okay, would this sort of white person tend to want to find this sort of black person to be beautiful? Well, sometimes they did. Sometimes they actually did. And other times you know, you have people with, genetics isn't so simple. So you'll have people who have a lot of African genes, but who look fairly white, and a lot of people with a lot of European genes, but who look, relatively dark skinned, relatively African. And so it would you would see an intermeshing, because this would be a gradual thing over many generations. And again, we see this sort of breaking down of these narrative ideas, these ideas that we've built up in our heads. They're being broken down as we look at the actual scientific data in front of us. So, what is that? That's one side of it. So, one side of it is a lot of what people are trying to push as being very strong, very, you know, very solid truths are actually just narrative truths, are actually just stories people have been telling each other, traditions people have been buying into that don't actually have so much strength to them. So what now? Where do I take this? Why is it not important to keep the characters of Helen of Troy, and this is another one of them that they've gotten up in arms about, the character of Severus Snape? Now, I will admit that Severus Snape is described very much as a pale white guy. He's also described, though, as being a. He's also described as being a peer of Lily Potter, meaning he's the same age as Lily Potter and Harry Potter's parents, which means he should be in his 30s or 40s age wise. Alan Rickman, who basically owns the most iconic portrayal of the character so far, is was his in his 50s or 60s when he began playing, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, he was in his he was in his, I think, 40s or early 50s when he actually began playing when his big film career started, started going. When he got cast as Hans Gruber in Die Hard, the original 1980s movie that started the whole series. Sorry, it he was never the right age for the character. But did that matter? Did somebody, was what was important to the character his birth date? Oh, by the way, Harry Potter, I think, grows up to be rather tall and gangly. But Daniel Radcliffe, who is, as of this point, the most iconic and the basic image of Harry Potter when people summon up that image. Harry Potter Daniel Radcliffe is actually kind of average to short. You know, so what's up with that? Well, they couldn't exactly predict where his teenage growth spurt would take him. He didn't, the his physical growth didn't follow the narrative growth. He and his character are two different, you know, beings. If we can say that the character of Harry Potter is actually a being the same way we are. That's another thing. Yeah, as somebody who has read a great number of books, like I have a list back there that's over 700 books long, and that's about where I stopped counting. As somebody who's read a lot of books and also seen a lot of adaptations of books, I come to realize that a lot of characters get changed around. I think the character in Jurassic Park, you don't have a charming Richard Attenborough as the park owner. You have this conniving sort of mercenary guy who gets munched on by compies at the end of the story. Sorry, spoilers. Um, Ian Malcolm dies at the end of the book. Again, spoilers. Uh, this Nedry doesn't just get attacked by a Dilophosaurus; he gets gutted. Um, the lawyer, I forget his name. The lawyer doesn't end up a dino snack. In fact, the lawyer is a lot. Gennaro is actually a lot more heroic of a character. And certainly the the the, the character of Dr. Grant in the book is a lot more traditionally manly than Sam Neill is. But would you trade Sam Neill for? Would you trade him in for a person who fit the physical type? You have all these wonderful actors who gave wonderful performances, and they made their own characters out of these fictional beings. They made their own. That's part of the value, I think. In It's part of the value in live performances, in live action. You don't just want something that's a copy of what's in the book. Uh, what's in the book is just a sort of a something you reconstruct, and that's probably why people are sort of attached to it. They want to imagine a certain character a certain way, but I've learned over time not to get so attached to that because there are there are joys, there it any adaptation is going to by necessity be a new version of the story. And this is what strikes me about the the whole controversy around this. There is already a version of the Odyssey out there. The that Hallmark version directed by Andrei Konchalovsky. That's a very good. I mean, there are some cheesy effects here and there, but it's very much a good version of a lot of the events of the Odyssey. But it's sort of like at a certain point, book is book, live action is live action. And Isabella Rossellini as Athena. You know, if there's that's a great casting. But what is Zendaya gonna be like? I don't know yet. You know what? That's the thing. There's a lot of backwards looking approaches to narrative these days. A lot of mournful turning towards the past, you know, turning towards what came before, and saying, this was great, and now everything after is lousy and in decline. And I think there's something poisonous about that attitude. Nostalgia is like any drug. A little bit of it yields a sense of warmth and a kind of not numbness, but perhaps relieved pain. But too much of it is a poison. Too much of it is, I mean, ironically, if we look at the Harry Potter series, there's actually a point where Harry Potter is in front of the mirror of Erised, and he's looking at his parents and seeing, you know, and he's very much, he never knew his parents, and seeing them there, around him, it gives him comfort. It gives him, you know, I guess warm feelings of sense of belonging that he's never had. But Dumbledore comes along and he tells him, it doesn't do to just sit in front of the mirror of this, it doesn't do to kind of dwell on this past and not live. And that's what we've become captives of the mirror of Erised. We're wasting away before that mirror. We're convinced that greatness is something that comes to us from the past, and that in order to regain it, we have to reach back into the past and keep reaching back. But here's my standard line about the past. The past belongs to God. At a certain point, the past belongs to God. Why is that? Well, I can speak about my experiences. When I was a child, I'd already lost two. By the time I was conscious of many things, I'd already lost half my grandparents. My paternal grandparents died. My paternal grandfather died before I was even born. My paternal grandmother, I think, died when I was very young. Um, However, my maternal grandparents, they lived well into my adulthood, and there was a long stretch of time where I didn't know a world without them. Um, Many of my relatives have passed on, including some unfortunately young ones. Um, lost to cancer and other causes. And finally, my parents' generation, my my dad's gone. So are you know aunts and uncles, and yeah, it's something that when I'm writing my own stories, my lead character has a big family, and a lot of his relatives are still around. And that's an unapologetic reflection of the warmth and sense of belonging that that past of mine brings to me. But you know what? At some point, I need to go out there and create a family of my own. Circumstances haven't been kind to that, but mm, maybe at some point they'll change. But the thing about it is, we, you know, those people, my grandfather's generation, my grandfather was literally part of the greatest generation. He literally landed in Normandy on D-Day. He didn't come by the beach. He was part of the 82nd Airborne, so they glided in on gliders and parachuted in. But he considered that one of the most important things he ever did. And considering all the successes he had later in life, considering that he had this, you know, big family with so many people, I, it's like I understand where he comes from in that, but it's still that that thing that he did at this point, 80 years or so ago, that was what stayed with him till the end. He was buried in his uniform. He, I've always been proud of him. But I think one of the things he taught me, that he provided to me, was a sense of the value of an education, the value of learning new things, you know the value of mythology. I think one of the books that shaped my perspective on story is uh, a, a book of a book of mythology that my parents got from him. And one of the things I've learned about mythology is that it was always in flux. That you have these characters, these gods and goddesses, but there were different versions of them over time. That there wasn't just one Odin. He was known by many different names, which is how you get Wednesday you know out of this the same god who we know as Odin, and Thor, and Tuesday. That's uh, um, a the Norse god of war. It's this is the interesting part about. I mean, you look at Roman and Greek gods, and essentially they either they're either different names for the same god, or they're different gods who then got kind of wedged together as the same god. So Minerva and Athena together, become one goddess, and so on and so forth. And if you look through mythology, if you look through history, you'll find that there are many different versions of them to begin with. So this notion that there is some solid, that there is this solid character to begin with, that is somehow a inviolable. It's bull hockey. There can damn well be a Black Helen of Troy. And you know what? There will exist alongside this Black Helen of Troy a white Helen of Troy, and Diane Kruger. She's, and there must be all kinds of different versions. And none of them, I mean, how many actual Greeks are actually cast, in any of these Odyssey movies, of any of these, you know, Ulysses movies, or whatever? Who is actually cast according to their ethnicity? Almost no one. This is kind of the fallacy of it all. The notion that, oh, a you must cast a white woman for this role. Is that, uh, is Helen of Troy's function to be, I mean, what's her function? To be beautiful, to be captivating, to be so beautiful and captivating that some idiot Paris, a prince of Troy, takes her, goes all the way back to, Troy with her, and this causes the Greeks, the Achaeans, to go over and lay siege to Troy and ultimately sack it. That's the function of the character. What does being black impede in that character's function? We can also go back to Snape. What is the function of Snape as a character? Snape is a double agent. He is a he is a man of ambiguous morality, ambiguous character, who has decided for his own reasons, for for love's sake, to betray his master, betray Voldemort and the Death Eaters in favor of Dumbledore and those others. He's a double agent. That is his purpose. What does being a black person in this current incarnation take away from that? Absolutely nothing. He can still play that aspect of his character perfectly well. There is nothing that changes simply because the skin color changes. You'd still need to play him a bit creepily. You'd still need him to be an imperious jerk. That's part of the character. That's the non-negotiable part. That's the part people really should be worried about, is whether he can play that sort of, you know, that sort of subtle hatefulness that Snape had. But it's really, other than that, the color is immaterial to it. The it's not a choice that is affected by his ancestry. Going back to, and, as I was discussing earlier, going back to T'Challa and Wakanda, why does he need to be a black character? Because that is a basic part of this story. That is a meaningful part of this story. The character was created to be representative, to be a black superhero in a time where there weren't really black superheroes, and over time he's evolved to be representative of a dream, of a notion you know of a society in Africa that could stand on its own, that didn't need to bend the knee to the Europeans and everything, and to colonialism, that they could be their own thing, you know, something, sort of a manifestation of pride in being African that and unconquered. And that's more than just some, you know, thing about some obsession with breeding, with being of the right breed, which some people have adopted. I mean, a lot of this DEI garbage, really, or anti-DEI garbage, to be perfectly accurate, is built on the notion that it's all been overblown, that all the racial tension and everything is there because there are people who have been kind of exploiting the tensions, that have been saying that they're victims when they're not really anymore. But who has been saying that they're not really victims anymore? Is it the people themselves, the people who actually suffered the harm? That years of discrimination, decades of, I mean, we're not even all that far past, if at all past, you know, racial profiling and policing and all that. Are we really past all the cultural harms and everything? Thus, such that we can say that folks should no longer be complaining? Is it really that simple? When somebody can basically kneel on a guy's neck for 9 minutes, which is about, scientifically speaking, about 5 minutes too long to keep brain function, brain cells from dying. You know, if somebody can do that with near impunity, despite the fact he was no longer even remotely harmful to anybody, is that unequal? I mean, this is another thing about the whole political correctness argument, is that you've got people wanting to say that I can say the harshest, most negative things to you. I can exclude you. I can say that you've got to sit down and shut up, and you've got to take it. Is that a position of equality? Equality is not, you know, there was this movie a while, in 2000 called Dungeons and Dragons. It was a silly piece of work, to be sure. And part of the silliness was, you have this very well-meaning, relatively well-acted, empress, played by Thora Birch, and she's given this sort of howler of a line. Uh, I'm going to make all people free and equal. Does just saying that actually give people that real status, that real ability to just stand up and, and go to a job interview, move into a neighborhood and not be treated as an outsider, as a threat? You know, it's like you can't just declare things and have them be real. It's the practical actions that people take. It's the behavior that people take. And one of these things that I've noticed over time, because I read a lot of books. I also watched a lot of movies. I was watching about two movies every week for from about uh, from about 1994 to 2002. You know, and that is like one of the things that kept coming up in the literature as I read through it was about how difficult it was to convince Hollywood to cast people other than white people. How difficult that was. Despite how liberal folks say that Hollywood is, for the longest time it was very difficult to get them to cast other than white people in major roles. Denzel Washington and and Will Smith sort of stood apart as being the the black guys we would cast, and that only changed very slowly. And then there's the other thing about women in the films. I know folks like to make a big deal of, oh, that woman uh, shouldn't be able to beat this person or beat that person. Should a guy be able to beat 100 people to death with his fists? No, no. As somebody who's actually been in a few fights myself, you know, fighting other people is exhausting work. It's but the long and the short of it is, you saw so many stories in which the strong female lead would end up being a damsel in distress by the end of the picture, and I got sick of that. I I want female characters who get to actually you know do all the things that male characters do for the most part. And we can not have arguments about what they're physically capable of doing, but the physical capabilities don't seem to be evenly, you know, the, the the realism of that doesn't seem to be evenly discussed when it comes to the male side of things. We talk about Mary Sue's, but what about Marty Stews, which is the male counterpart to that, to the Mary Sue character. And it's like, it's, it just occurs to me that a, a lot of people have decided that, for the sake of nostalgia, that, you know, men need to take back everything, need to put everybody else back in their boxes once again. And I couldn't disagree. I couldn't disagree more. I mean, I want there. Yeah, I want to dance. I want other people invited to the dance. I want everybody having fun. Everybody being part of this. And that way, when you have everybody more involved, more included, it people take more responsibility. They they when you're not having to defend your very right to exist in a space, well, maybe you get a little bit less strict about having to enforce all the boundaries. People can be more peaceable. They can kind of work together without being so sensitive. If you want less sensitivity, if you want people less guarded, less, if you want less walking on eggshells, that comes as people become, more secure, have less of a feeling that they're going to get, you know, screwed over if they let their guard down. And that's not what that's not what the MAGA folks, that's not what the culture warriors are actually creating here. Instead, they're creating a situation where people are going to be more guarded, where people are going to be more up in arms, or more defensive. You understand that? You understand that, you're not really actually, you're making it harder for people like me. You defenders of, whiteness on screen. You're not making it to where I'm more proud of my Western or my European ancestry. In fact, you're kind of representing the darker, less appetizing, less savory parts of our character for the last, you know, couple centuries. I mean, it's one thing to kind of have, back in the 50s, back in the 40s, and before, I think a lot of this was innocent. The way, you know, a bratty kid can be innocent, you know, it's sort of misbehavior and prejudice and, you know, because you simply don't know better, because you're starting off evolving from a place where you didn't have to deal with all this diversity. You didn't have to deal with, women as equals. You didn't have to deal, it wasn't even an idea yet. I mean, we're just starting. We have been doing this America thing for about 250 years now. And part of, even now, we're still dealing with the hangovers of the culture of monarchy and aristocracy. We still have sort of, we still talk about a person being noble as a character description, as having higher values or something. And that's, inevitably language has those sort of ghosts within them. You sort of have that sort of, you have to express new ideas about your new society, but you have to adapt old terms, evolve old terms in order to speak of it. I guess part of my point here is that we're still having to kind of painfully evolve forward past what we've been before, and I feel like it's a step back to all of a sudden say, "Oh, you can't possibly cast a black person as Helen of Troy or a black person as Severus Snape. You can't cast black people where there once were white people. You can't cast women where they once were men." Sort of this very protective, very sort of, safeguardy sort of, we've got to, w- we can't let them do this woke DEI thing. But here's the thing about the whole woke DEI sort of racket that I think a lot of grifters have adopted. I think it is a way to introduce racism, prejudice, and bigotry back into society without having people audit, without having people examine the logic behind it. You back people into it. You sort of go, oh, you know, aren't we being a bit overzealous in our inclusion here? Aren't we being a little overzealous in not looking at these people's faults? And before you know it, you have a president saying that black immigrants are eating people's pets, and his followers aren't picking up on how freaking racist, how freaking barbarically racist that whole that whole presentation is. It's like cringe level. I mean, it's basically college level racism. I mean, when Obama was in office, and you had these people who were posting this, watermelon patches and welfare bucks cartoons. It was like, holy crap! I'm looking at this stuff, and it's like when I was in college, one of my English teachers had us read this book that was basically about all the old stereotypes of black people. And I'm horrified to find that these stereotypes, which were basically um, at that point just old archetypes in a college textbook, to see that sort of archetype come up in the real world, where it's like, holy, they're actually doing the watermelon thing. As a kid who enjoyed watermelon all his life without any sort of idea of what sort of baggage that carried, and who ate fried chicken by the bucket with my family. I mean, it was sort of like shocking to see that was actually part of a stereotype, but to see that people actually pushing that stereotype in the real world, it's like, oh my god, it isn't as dead as I thought it was. It isn't as dead as I thought it was. And seeing people trying to enforce racial standards of casting, it's the same damn feeling. The racism isn't dead. It's still there. There are still people who get bent out of shape if a fictional or legendary character gets recast with a person of another color. Because they're insisting it has to be historical. It has to be historical. No, it doesn't. Nobody bothers to be historical about casting Greeks as, Odysseus and the rest of the cast. Nobody. I mean, it's like, what are you protecting? What are you really protecting here? Is Western civilization white civilization? Is that what you're protecting? I don't think Western civilization equates to white civilization. I think a lot of what Western civilization adopted and syncretized and finally advanced humanity with, to the extent that it did, was as much borrowed from all the non-white civilizations out there, or stored and remembered by the non-white civilizations, by by I mean, there were ages in which medieval scholars looking to find things out, they would go to the Orient to find those things out. They would go to the Near East, to the Far East to rediscover these things. Both because, folks in the Far East had, come up with things on their own, but also they would go to the Islamic empires preserved a lot of the old Greek philosophy that had been lost as, the Roman Empire collapsed, as the Byzantine Empire collapsed. You know, things that led to us to eventually rediscover many things that were lost in the Dark Ages, leading to the Renaissance. It's sort of, there's a complicated relationship between Western civilization and its counterparts. But, there's a complex interchange. Things were passed back and forth. It wasn't simply one way or the other. And I think Western civilization gaining this self awareness is a good thing. It's part of the strength of Western civilization that it has a philosophical base that can accommodate that sort of thing, that it doesn't destroy us to learn, that it doesn't destroy us to advance, to get past nostalgia and start discovering things of our own. I mean, you don't need to have the exclusive claim to greatness. You don't have need to have the exclusive claim to being an advanced society, an advanced civilization. You know, and there is an extent to which we need to learn how to get along with others, with other civilizations around the planet. You know, because there's a reason why Mahatma Gandhi cracked that joke. When he was asked about what he thought of Western civilization, he said, "It's a very good idea." But really, we it's. I mean, if there's one criticism I have of some of these sort of things, is that we don't need to punish people for seeking out wisdom, seeking out understanding in other people's um civilizations and other people's ideas. You know, I have a strong appreciation for the way um, anime and manga, for how they give their characters emotional you know and psychological depth, and not just treat them like toys or just simple archetypes. It's I think there's a certain point at which we need to, but let's go further into it. There is an aspect of this that I haven't yet fully explored, and that is that at a certain point, we're wanting to maintain something that is a fiction. We're talking about what is the canonical race of a character, and it doesn't occur to many people that when we start talking about the objective facts about a a a, a character, a person who doesn't really exist. If we're talking about if we're talking about, say, if we're talking about Abraham Lincoln was a white guy. That's And if we want to establish something as being a historical documentary or a period piece, about history, we don't cast Denzel Washington as Abraham Lincoln. Um, we instead cast Daniel Day Lewis, and that's not a slight against Denzel Washington's abilities. In fact, he does a great Macbeth. No, it, but that's another thing, really. Macbeth wouldn't have been a black man, wouldn't he? And this is where we get into the problem of insisting on these sort of artificial sort of necessities. And this is where the title of this story kind of will begin to make sense. And that is that ultimately we are testifying to the characteristics of a person who does not exist, or who, if they did exist, then they exist as a character whose origins are lost to the mists of time, and who have become largely symbolic as characters rather than being, you know, historical figures. And then there's a question of whether the story is even meant to be an accurate reflection of the time and place, or whether it is meant to be a more theatrical, more artificial, more postmodern sort of story. And we get something of that in the Cohen version of Macbeth. That's that the Apple Studio did. Where it wasn't really that important that we ethnically cast Macbeth as a Scotsman. That was what was more important was the nature of the character, the vibe of the character, who anybody on stage could play. That we were stepping into a world of imagination where it didn't quite matter what the origins were of any of the characters, ethnically speaking, or whether the characters. I mean, you could do a staging of Macbeth where instead of having you know you could stage Macbeth such that every character is gender flipped. And you might say, "Oh, that's so." No, do it. See what comes of it. Experiment. See what meaning you can draw. If it's a woman playing, the Scottish Thane, if it's a woman playing the, you know, or a man playing um, the Lady Macbeth character, the laddie Macbeth, I guess you could call him. You could do so many variations on this. You could do, you know, Hamlet's been done so many different ways, you know, by so many different people. You've got the sumptuous 4-hour Brana version. You have the slightly lethal weapon Mel Gibson version. You have Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, which is basically the play seen from the, you know, eyes of a couple of side characters who mystically, pop in and out of reality as they kind of, um, as they are drawn into the events of the story. It's like it's there's so many different ways to address these old sort of public domain, these old sort of myths and legends. Nobody is obligated to do everything as a as long as I think as long as you're honest with the audience about your intentions, as long as you're not going to pretend like that it was normal, that this is all, as long as you accept the fictionalization of it, I think it's entirely okay to kind of go in your own direction. And in fact, it may be better for us if we start to do that. If if we kind of relax some of our attitudes about canon and backstory and these other things, because as a person who's actually handled a bit of this myself, as an unpublished author, I've learned by hard experience what happens when you're kind of paralyzed in place, when you're kind of just when you've got a better idea that could take the story in a different, more satisfying direction. It's There's so much creativity, there's so much you can do. And if you want people to learn history, it can always be presented in a less sort of hostile fashion. You can always say to people, okay, so this person would have actually been like this and looked like this. You don't need to be hostile about it. I mean, there are sort of agendas here and there about it. That there are people who want, you know, a more pronounced sort of character to it, but you don't actually defeat those people by being as harsh and angry and, you know constrictive about it. And I think one thing to keep in mind is we're dealing with the Odyssey. L- Let's Let me say this. I try my best to let a story fail me rather than me force the story to fail me. What do I mean by that? I mean, there was a movie a while back, a vampire movie starring Dennis Miller, um, where it's it's the cringiest sort of thing, the most and one of the crappiest sort of vampire stories. You know, it's one of those tales from the crypt uh, movies. And I wanted, I like Dennis Miller as a comic. He was one of my favorite Weekend Update hosts. You know, I desperately enjoyed his snark in that role. But it's that sort of thing that a lot of unfortunately that a lot of um, it's like we need to be. It's just he didn't quite hit it out of the park. There was a lot of dumb stuff in that, but I gave it a chance. I I gave plenty of some pretty lousy movies a chance and got some enjoyment out of it. But it was sort of like, well, this is kind of underwhelming here, and this is kind of flat for me. But I'll let it give what value it can to me while I'm watching it. And it was like, you know, there was this version of The Crow, a sequel to The Crow, and when I watched it, it was like, this isn't as good as the original. And this was long before the newest version that went into theaters. I'm not looking for everything to fit into some canon or to something. I've been alive long enough that I've been well, for example, with Batman, I remember when Batman was da 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 the '60s series da 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 Batman da 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 and we even did that song on recorders in music class, I think. But it's like I went from that to Tim Burton's, brilliant Dark Knight in the Batman 1989 and Batman Returns. And then you had, I never had much love, comparatively speaking. Um, I understood sort of the vibe that they were trying to go back towards the sort of back towards the kitsch of the 1966 Batman, but at the same time, it was like eh, when Nolan's Batman came along, I I was fully intrigued with it. I like the idea that he's sort of an evolution of a ninja of a kind that kind of made a certain kind of intuitive sense. Um, dark figure who uses, tools to kind of, you know, sneak around Gotham City and, you know, confront the criminals. And it's sort of like, then you get into the Snyder Batman. And I know this might offend some, but I didn't particularly mind the Snyder Batman. I know Batman doesn't kill. That's, the comic book sort of thing. But you have to remember that my first live action, you know, film Batman was the Burn Batman, and the Burn Batman kills people. So it's sort of like it it goes back to that whole, different version of gods, different version of legendary characters. I mean, it's like there's multiple versions of King Arthur if you go through things like you have Mark Twain's version, you have Alfred Lord Tennyson's version, you have La Morte d'Arthur, uh, Sir Thomas Mallory's, and before that, I think it was Geoffrey of Monmouth. And you have different characters, different representations of the characters, different ideas of what the characters meant. You even had the bonkers sort of 1981 Excalibur version, and you had all different kinds of versions of Robin Hood. You know, my big one was Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. That Kevin Costner's. I mean, for all his accent was all over the place. He certainly his Robin Hood is a was a fun action packed sort of Robin Hood, and that's the one that I remember best. And you can have all these different variations, but I think part of the problem in a number of cases is that they wanted to do the realistic version, and they forgot that no matter how realistic, no matter how real you can make a character like that. You can make a Robin Hood or a King Arthur or any other sort of legendary figure, no matter how real you can claim to make them, they'll never will be entirely real. And in fact, trying to push things, trying to, I mean, it seems like in our day and age, we are more interested in turning up the realism and the accuracy on things that have no objective existence in reality, like fictional characters or legendary quasi fictional characters or mythological characters, things where it doesn't really matter whether they're real or not, where everything is just floating in the land of the imaginary, and we're trying to give real reality, solid reality to that, but it's a foundation of sand. There is nothing underneath it to keep it, to support it ultimately. I mean, for heaven's sakes, Helen of Troy is one of a pair of twins born of an egg of a union between um I think it was Queen or Princess Leda of Sparta and Zeus in the form of a swan. I mean, we are sort of getting into the we're sort of asking at this point, how does this even work? Uh, and so, what race is that person? What race is that person? Is that person even possible? And if we're being completely realistic, the answer is no. Helen of Troy isn't even possible in that version. It's, I mean, you can come up with some, like I think the term is euhemerism, where you basically come up with a mundane explanation for the symbolism that ultimately becomes the mythological sort of. But it's sort of you're just at this point you're just kind of making up. You're still making up crap. You're just making up crap to rationalize something fictional as real. And this is where you get into trouble. Because when you start rationalizing fictional things as real, that doesn't make them real. That makes you crazy or deluded or whatever. It makes it to where that you're just trying to. But if it's fictional to start with, then it's not bad. It's not, and the meaning is preserved. Like the most, a beautiful woman who's a charismatic woman who who attracts and leads Paris to kidnap her and take her back to Troy and you know ignites that war. Once you've done that, once you've served that part of the story, does it matter? You're telling a story. You're presenting a fiction. You are no you are basically at this point, technically speaking, lying. You are, but you're kind of lying with the audience's consent, and this is where it gets even nastier to have this whole thing revolve around race. Because at this point, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get people to withdraw consent for the fiction on the grounds that, oh, they've got the wrong race for a character whose function in the story isn't dependent on race. So this is the sort of the darkness that I was referring to at the beginning. And the darkness we're in right now is because, you know, we're kind of crossing, going one way for our fiction and going the other way for the rest of our reality. We are becoming besotted with fictionalized, you know, versions of our real world over here where we are twisting what's going on around us, where we have this confabulator, this liar as president who is making up things as he goes along to justify things. And he's getting people to treat, for example, COVID like it's no big deal, getting people to treat COVID like it's a fiction, like it's something that a bunch of people just made up in order to give Trump a hard time. And what's the result of that? People are doing things that they should not be doing, things that risk their lives, things that risk their health. And it's spreading into how people deal with other vaccines, how people deal with other viruses and diseases that are actually multiple times more deadly and more hazardous to people's health than COVID is. COVID is sort of the canary in the coal mine, but the canary in the coal mine is, the people are actually getting to the point where they're confronted with something like hantavirus, which is about 20, 30, 40% fatal to people. What was COVID by comparison? Half a percent. Half a percent. Can you imagine the death toll concerning, with an American population? If we lost about 1 million to 2 million people over COVID, which was a half a percent, we're talking 10, 20 million people easily for something like if SARS, the original coronavirus infection that struck back in 2003, 2004, if that had struck instead, you'd have literally tens of millions of people dead if we did the same things. And God help us if we had something like Ebola, which is 50 to 90% lethal. We're lucky that it's not an airborne virus, but unluckily, it's also one of the ones that, mere contact, where if you shook hands with somebody who had COVID, you might stand a good chance of not getting sick. You shake hands with somebody who's got, Ebola blood on their hands, and it's like you're probably you're not just probably infected, you're probably dead as a result. And people are going to treat that as no big deal. Talk about your FA and FO if they try doing that. That's part of why a person like me looks at that and says, "Why are we approaching infectious disease like that? That is crazy." Because you're not just going to be dealing with the half percent killers. You'll be dealing with killers like SARS and diphtheria. One of the one of the diphtheria pertussis tetanus shots. Diphtheria is a 10% killer, and not just a 10% killer, but a 10% killer of children. And people are wanting to screw around with that. This is why it's important to keep a good grasp on reality when it comes to reality. At the same time, if you're dealing with fiction, we need to kind of revive the sense that there is a distinction between fiction and reality. We need to realize that we can't be simply using all the tools of fiction to try and manipulate people about reality, because sooner or later that leads to a kind of political psychosis where people are essentially reacting to things that aren't there while failing to react to the things that are. And in the meantime, with stories, it's like we're kind of squeezing the life out of our ability to, just tell a story. As good as it is to, be able to keep track of all the things, I've found that there's a certain joy in being able to just compose a story and not have to care too much about what the what the backstory is, what the factual background is, and what you know, to kind of just make up the story and be unashamed that you're making up the story. I found out something interesting. Somebody was arguing with me about um, someone was arguing with me about how a race change negatively affected the Wild Wild West, uh, um, which was a adaptation of an old 1965 to 1968 um, sort of Western James Bond sci-fi sort of hybrid. And I was arguing with them about how I was arguing with them about how many of the things like the big mechanical spider that John Peters wanted, and the rather anatomical looking um, magnetic, you know, decapitation blade launcher um, that featured in some part of the story, and all the other things that that sort of misbegotten adaptation had. Um, it's like he was arguing about how that race change had violated the nature of the work because uh, the original James West, if that's his name, was played um, by a white actor. So I go, I start talking about Men in Black and about what that was like, and I do some research about the original comic that Men in Black was based on, and come to find out, the character of Jay, who is portrayed by Will Smith in the movies, and famously so, was a blonde white guy in the original. That sort of tells you everything. That there was no objective reality there. You had you could talk about it being you know, book accurate or whatever. You could talk about it being comics accurate, but the story worked basically just as well as it needed to, being its own thing. And what I suggested was that you could have put somebody who's a bit more serious in the role and kind of kept the technology high tech, but kind of um sort of I guess you could say a steampunk sort of aesthetic, but a lot more restrained than the sort of than what showed up in I mean it's sort of what worked with Batman Returns, and although people kind of followed that too heavily, and we're talking what Nolan did. Um, I mean, it's sort of there was that whole tradition in the early 2000s of kind of grounding superheroes more in physical and psychological reality. And you sort of get a, yeah, like all things, it's sort of there's sort of a back and forth between it. Because at a certain point, you're still talking about a character who, I mean, there isn't much realistic about a story where somehow a guy packs a whole bunch of explosives onto a ferry and nobody notices, or he gets a whole bunch of gasoline together and nobody notices again. It's like at a certain point you just gotta drop it and say, you know what, this is a story. You know what, this is fictional. I'm going to relax. I'm going to just let it flow. And if it breaks at some point, then I didn't make it break. I didn't force it to break. I didn't demand something of the story, you know, going in. I said, "Okay, this is fiction. I'm going to let fiction be fiction. I'm going to let them tell the story. And I'm going to say, is this, all inaccuracies aside, is this good, or does it really sabotage it to do things the way it's being done?" And I guess that's sort of my attitude on it. I let if the story is going to lose me, I let it lose me on its own accord. I don't force myself to lose the story. I don't say if they don't have this character in it, if they don't adapt this part, if they don't do this exactly like it's done in the comics, I am quitting this. I don't like to do that because guess what? I like to have a sort of a zen sort of attitude towards it. It's all fake, anyways. This is just a different. Somebody paints a different picture. Somebody writes a different character. Somebody does a different take on the character. I don't necessarily like each take on it. I don't necessarily think that um, X-Men 3, Brett Ratner's takes on things. I don't particularly like the way he went about it. I have very little love for the beyond guilty pleasure sort of humor for the uh for I mean I enjoy it sort of as its own sort of guilty pleasure, you know, Wolverine origins. Especially the "I'm going to run past the cages with my claws out" moment. That was kind of like, uh, mm, but it's like I generally just try to. I'm one of the easier sort of story audiences, but part of it's because I like to enjoy story as story. I don't fault myself for just letting giving in, just letting it flow. And I've never found myself unable to reject a story that fails at things, or to say this failed at that, and I can understand why people didn't enjoy it, or why people objected to this. But at a certain point, I think the objections become less and less in good faith and more a part of this overall attempt to kind of force a social change, force a change in attitude. And this is one that I don't really appreciate because it works to diminish the creativity, diminish the variety, diminish the sort of the dance, the carnivalesque dance of all the different sort of actors and personalities and whatever. It just ultimately seems to strangle creativity, strangle fiction in the name of trying to make it truer. How do you make something that is fiction more? I mean, there are certain things that you can reflect in a fictional story that you need to be responsible about how you reflect them. But the character's ethnicity, in this case, I don't think is one of them. It's there's really no point to it. The character is there to be beautiful. The character is there to, you know, become an object of lust or love by, you know, Paris, the Trojan prince who takes her back to Troy, and we organize the whole fleet to go to Troy, and then, you know, sack Troy, take her back, and all sorts of different things happen. But it's like, why do we have to keep on reviving the old nasty tales, the old nasty storylines, especially on the 250th anniversary of this country, where we've made such incredible progress in those 250 years, but you're gonna have these people who just want it all to be stuffed back into the box out of which it came. So that's my take on that, and y'all have a good night, morning, whatever.